again to our sixth meeting in our series of meetings regarding our Southeast Guided Coalition efforts. I want to thank you very much for your commitment and for your ongoing participation. This process has been really exciting because of the feedback and the directions and the questions that you send our way that further help us to refine our thinking and come up with more collaborative ways and more interesting ways to meet the needs of our communities. Our hope is that by December or early January, we will have a recommendation to the Deputy Superintendent stating our collective agreed upon feeder patterns for Kellogg and the plan for Harrison Park as it becomes a 6 to 8 school from its current configuration of a K8. We do look forward to hearing from you. We'll also be hearing from some of our board members tonight who will revisit our charge and the scope for this work. We thank you for your time commitment. We know that your time is of value. Our goal for tonight is to make sure again that this is a very productive investment for you and that you do see what we're trying to do as we strategize and kind of try to create a vision for our district going forward. Last week, we set the stage to review some scenarios proposed by some of our members. Your feedback and your questions helped us create those scenarios. We are going to be looking at those scenarios again tonight, and we're going to be looking for recurring themes as you share your thinking with us. Please keep the questions, your feedback, and your ideas coming. At the end of the session this evening, you will have the opportunity to complete the evaluation form and also to give us more feedback. We're going to continue to refine this process to shape our thinking. Later in the presentation, we will share the various forums that we use for our information gathering process so that there is an understanding that we're trying to get to the grassroots and reach our parents and our communities as much as we possibly can. In addition to hearing from us, you will hear from some of our board members tonight. We have Director Scott Bailey, Director Rita Moore, and Director Julia Brim Edwards, who will be joining us tonight. We will get into our breakout groups at Kent's prompting to review a few more scenarios created from feedback that we received. We're hoping that by the end of the meeting tonight, we'll be much closer to achieving the Phase 1 goals stated earlier in this process. Once again, I do want to thank you for being here. I also extend our gratitude to our partners, Flow Analytics, for collaborating with us through this process. Jed, can you move us to slide 2? Next slide. Our meeting objectives for tonight is our goal is to clarify the outcome goals and implementation timelines for Phase 1 and Phase 2. We also will be clarifying the process for scenario feedback and data requests, and we'll be looking at scenario refinement, vis-a-vis a confirmation of understanding of middle school feeder patterns and opportunities, as well as the constraints that we have to wrestle with. We'll review and refine our scenarios to date with focus on middle school feeder patterns, and then we'll define the consensus approach for deciding our proposals. Next slide. In staying true to our beliefs and our values at PPS, we are asking that everyone stay engaged mentally, physically, emotionally. We ask that you speak your truth responsibly. We want you to truly share your thinking with us. There isn't a predetermined decision that's been made or will be made. Every decision will be based on the input that you give to us. We want you to listen, to understand, and to believe. We're going to be transparent as much as possible. We're also going to ask that you ask questions so that we can clarify thinking as needed. Be willing to do things differently and experience discomfort. This is a very uncomfortable process because we all know that we all can't get what we all want. Expect and accept non-closure. That's part of community building, to just have an understanding that there will be challenges, and there are challenges that we'll not be able to resolve tonight, but maybe we'll be able to address down the road. That said, I would like to yield the floor to our directors, Scott Bailey and Director Rita Moore. as they share with us the charge for this work. Next slide.
Thank you, Esther. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, good. So welcome again. I'm Scott Bailey. I was elected to the board 3 years ago. Director Moore recently had surgery, so she's a little hoarse. So she says she's not going to say much tonight, but yeah, we'll see how that works out. I just want to thank you all for agreeing to serve on the committee. I imagine some of you have been thinking, what in the world did I volunteer for at this point? And I want to say I feel your pain. These are issues that I personally and Director Moore also have been involved with going back to 2006 when we were parents, well before we were on the board. We were there when K-8s were created. We were part of a network of parents who documented the inequities in K-8s starting at a very early point. Both of us served on the Superintendent's Advisory Committee for Enrollment and Transfer, which actually had 2 iterations. We were on both 1 and 2. I think it was 2010, working with Judy Brennan, we prepared some slides to show to school board members that said, wow, our enrollment at schools is way out of whack. We need to rebalance boundaries. We were there when there were some earlier versions of boundary changes. We were there, well, both of us have been advocating for a review of focus option schools. We haven't been successful yet, but give us some more time. I served on DBRAC, which was the first, and Beth Kavanaugh is, I see her smiling. It's a little, we get a little shaky sometimes when we recall that time period. It was an incredible challenge at a lot of meetings, sitting with a lot of the same issues that you're feeling, a lot of the same tensions that you're feeling. And finally, one of the things I did when I was on DBRAC was to provide some technical assistance to a group of parents in Southeast before DBRAC even took a look at Southeast to anticipate what might changes look like if we moved from K-8s to K-5 in middle school. And that group of parents developed, and Beth was part of that as well, developed a number of scenarios and pretty much came to the conclusion, not that there was one scenario that was better than the other, but that Harrison Park was the only logical choice for a second middle school in Southeast. So I want to kind of again go over that tells you that long history really informed for the 2 of us and for other board members as well, informed the outcomes that the board established for this process, which again is going to be district-wide. And one of the tensions, Beth, thank you, that DBRAC was the district-wide boundary review advisory committee, which also had 2 iterations, but that's a long story. But there's a lot of tensions. I, for a long time, pushed for one single district-wide process. And really, if you think it's difficult doing a community process just in Southeast, doing a district-wide one, even without COVID, would have stretched this district to the breaking point in terms of trying to staff that kind of a process. So here we are doing some chunks of the district at a time. And a number of you have pointed out the issues in doing that, and you're not wrong. But I want to again go over the broad things that the board is looking for in terms of what we're trying to change here. And it's important to remember what we have now is inequitable and needs to be changed. And we're not gonna, there's no perfect answer out there. There's even some tensions between the four outcomes that we're looking for. But we want to get as close to that as we can. And it's really important, the work that all of you are doing in helping us develop better scenarios and solutions, in critiquing us, both in terms of the process and the outcomes. Um, you know, I'm reading your comments. Just finished watching the last week's meeting to catch up. What you're doing is incredibly valuable. So again, the four things we're looking for district-wide as we go through this large process is, number one, that shift from to K-5s in middle schools. And we're going to try to do that as much as possible across the district. There might be one or two exceptions, but that's so important to have a system that's as uniform as possible going forward. A second thing is to minimize single-strand co-located programs, particularly on the neighborhood side. We've just seen the inequities in so many schools. That's just not a good configuration. Number three, we want to create a really continuum of services within each cluster for students receiving special education services. We've seen too often those children get shifted from one school to another. We want them to be able to stay with a cohort as much as possible going K through 12. And secondly, we want to expand or locate pre-K, or well, actually expand with, thanks to state money, expand pre-K options strategically throughout the district. And finally, and I know you all spent a lot of time talking about this in at least your last meeting, trying to figure out a better way of service around our dual language immersion programs. And again, with the primary purpose of those programs is to serve native speakers. It's just a superior model for doing that. Next slide, please. So what we're looking for, again, phase one, phase two, is to try to nail down those feeder patterns for the middle schools. And then in starting in February, really working out the boundaries and the DLI locations at the elementary level. And again, our goal is balanced enrollment. And again, that'll be, and you've seen the scenarios, it's a real challenge. And it raises a lot of bigger picture questions. I know to one of the comments, for example, was, gosh, we've got some Southeast elementaries outside of the area that are less diverse and wealthier populations where they have 500 students in a school versus we're looking at maybe some 300 student K-5s in more diverse, lower income areas. Is that equitable? And if not, what can we do to address that? Again, this is not easy work. I appreciate that. We are listening. We're counting on you to help us come up with not a perfect solution, but the best solution possible, and to help ensure that our school communities across the full diversity are informed and engaged in this process. And so, Director Moore, if you want to chime in with a couple of words, go for it.
Sorry, trying to unmute. No, I think you covered most of it, and after a whole day of meetings, my voice is pretty much gone. So I'll stick with the chat, I think. Thanks.
More on the timeline. Just, I guess, one final comment. The timeline for this process sucks. Pardon me, I know this is a family show, and it just does, as do a lot of things under COVID. And it is what it is. And I wish we had more time. And we've got a middle school to open up, and we've got some inequities that have been around for years that need to be addressed. And that, to me, is really what is driving my timeline, is addressing those inequities. And there you go. And I understand the tensions. And I also want to say, being through processes before, one of the tensions is we need more time. We need more information. And yet we need to have a final product. We need to make a decision and get our kids in a better place. Too much information, not enough information. It's really difficult. I get that. And we need to come to a resolution and get our kids in a better place.
Thank you, Director Bailey and Director Moore, for your comments. We are at that point where we really appreciate that refocusing for us of our coalition charge and each of the phases. And so this chart here just really shows, kind of follows up to what Director Bailey was discussing, our timeline. And so please note that fall of 2021 is where the start of the new Kellogg feeders would happen for grades 6-8 for those K schools that get reconfigured to K5, and then I'm also moving those over to Kellogg. But please note that for the other feeder patterns, there is more time. We do have another full year, and those really wouldn't open and start until fall of 22, along with boundary changes for all school levels at that time. So we do have some separation between really looking at all of the DLI moves that could potentially happen, and we have more time to get more communication from each of the communities before that time. So this refocus that we're going to be jumping into tonight really is to look at that feeder pattern and create the feeder pattern for Kellogg Middle School for 2021. So our work today and tonight will start that process. So I turn over to Esther for the next slide and just reviewing our communication engagement. You're on mute, Esther.
Sorry, thank you very much, Kent. You are right, our timeline is a little shortened. However, I do believe that we can do it. There have been questions about how we've reached out to the community. Most of our outreach has been through surveys. We've had online surveys, we've also had telephone surveys. And many of you have sent in questions. You've also given us feedback. And that's how primarily we've gathered a lot of the information that we use to design our medium of communication and the information that shapes our thinking moving forward. Again, the goal for phase 1 is to find a feeder pattern for Kellogg Middle School. And the other goal is to look at Harrison Park becoming a K5. Becoming a middle school, pardon me. So the K5 will be moving. That's the goal for this stretch of the job. In the spring, we will look at phase 2 and we'll undertake a lot more challenges around the DLI programs and the co-location programs that we have. In an attempt to clarify the process for scenarios, feedback, and data requests, we have we continue to call whatever you send in to us. We simplify and look for themes. We also look for areas that seem to resonate across the board much more so than others. And based on that, we go back to the drawing board and we come up with a scenario that will address that need. So I appreciate last week some people saying that they don't think that their input is being taken into consideration. Everyone's input is being considered, and your input is valuable. So please keep sending them in. We have tried a variety of avenues of feedback. We have a community feedback form that we constantly address and look at the information on there. We also do have direct email. We have the Southeast Guiding Coalition email chain. We call the Zoom chat when we're in session. We look for community letters for those who have been in this process for a number of years and have had experiences with other forums prior to now. We look for their experiences as well. We do have the chat room that we use during this meeting. And we do also look at the information that you provide for us during our meetings. We want to be sure that we are making it all available to the coalition in a responsible way, so that at least we have currently 122 comments and 56 pages of text and letters that we constantly review to create our themes. Next slide.
Well, with that input, we have had many data requests, as you can see, from the coalition, and data is real important for our coalition members as we work in our workshops and work in our work groups during the workshops in order to create scenarios to be modeled. You can see that we've worked to really theme the data requests to date so far, and the vast majority of these have been completed. As you can see in blue, and have been either responded back to in the Q&A or responded back to people individually or back to work groups that may have requested that data. There are a few other pieces of data that are a little bit harder sometimes to capture because we may have to work in concert with Portland Public in order to get that information, and then Jed would put that into a form that can be relayed. And so again, we just wanted to show that we have had many data requests, and the vast majority have been answered. If you want to flip to the next slide, Jed. And going forward, we really work to determine our processes to make sure that we're not missing requests. And so please continue to submit in the small groups, notes, and the worksheets, and also between meetings, submit through the weekly feedback. Hopefully by the end of the day on Sunday, so that we can get that information back to you earlier in the week. We're really working to fulfill the requests within 1 week if we can. However, some may take a little bit longer than that. I don't know if you want to add to that or not, Esther.
Yes, I was going to say that it is also okay for you to send us emails. Many of you actually send emails as we speak, and the emails are valuable because we're able to also pull the data and your requests from there. So keep all the communication lines open. We are excited that you're participating and you're thinking beyond what's offered in the Zoom sessions, and we look forward to what you have to share with us all the time. Next slide. We also have opportunities for collaboration between meetings. We do not share the data that is sent to us. We only share that data as is necessary with members of our coalition group. Please make sure that all your members are included in the email thread so they can get the information that we send out. Our data requests and scenario suggestions that emerge in the email thread should be submitted through other channels for follow-up. We're open to supporting other ways for members to collaborate between meetings. Please just let us know and we'll make the necessary adjustments to accommodate your needs. Next slide. Ken?
New messages received from Bailey.
I think you covered most of this, Esther. So we do want to make sure, as she said, make sure that we're supporting other ways for members to collaborate between the meetings. So if you have an idea or something you'd like us to consider, please bring that forward.
Right.
Go next slide.
So we will be using a fist to five approach. Kent, you want to speak more to this fist to five approach?
Yeah, folks may have seen this before in other settings. It'll be a little bit different in our virtual setting in that we're not going to try to look at people's, fist 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 and document it that way. You'll actually have a chance to vote what your number is for the question that we ask. And so Jed is going to be running a practice for us tonight on this process. If you're at a 0 or a 1 or even a 2, what we will do, and maybe not tonight, but as we move forward in this process, we'll ask you, okay, why are you a 0 or a 1 or a 2? So what, is there something there? Is there a tweak on this scenario that could be done that might move you to a higher number that is more consensus? And so we'll definitely look for that. You'll actually get to see tonight the data from everyone's voting in this manner around the scenarios that we have so far. And you'll actually see a couple of them. We're going to probably group, because now that we're looking at strictly the feeder systems, there are really kind of 2 feeder systems that have been presented so far in all of our 8 scenarios. And so you'll get a chance to weigh in on your thoughts on each of those in this type of a model. As we move forward with this, we do have to winnow down consensus for different proposals that we bring forward to the open houses, and then ultimately the recommendation that would go before the board. And so we'll be looking at what that final consensus is, and it may be on a final vote, it may be a majority depending upon the numbers that are provided. So we'll work through that as a group, but this will be the model that we will use moving forward. And I'm going to pass it over to Jed to get into the next part of our presentation tonight, which is a review of where we've been.
Yeah, so I'm going to start talking about data as I normally do. And I'm really going to take us, this is more of a setup to get us into our breakout rooms and get working. So we wanted to, again, refocus ourselves on the middle school grades and the feeder patterns. So we put together this week a couple of data resources that drill down to those grades 6 through 8 students and the characteristics of those students and the facilities that we hope to get them enrolled in. And so the first slide I'm going to show you here is grade 6 through 8 enrollment, and really want to highlight here the middle school capacity that you're seeing on this. So it is those numbers in halo. Those are the functional capacity of the buildings that we've identified for middle schools. And so really the challenge here is to fit all those blue and orange bars underneath those black limits for functional capacity, essentially. And I do want to note here that you see a big cohort of DLI associated with Mount Tabor, and there are 277 students currently enrolled in that Japanese dual language immersion program there. So that's really one of the more challenging as far as finding a home for that program while also managing for the neighborhood programs that would be alongside that. So the next slide I've got for you here is really the same slide as before, this time with the enrollment forecast. So the overall trend is downward with just a handful of exceptions here that I've noted. And I do want to just note here that Harrison Park, it's Chinese DLI, at this point goes through grade 8 by the 2024 school year there. Although it is pretty small, you see it there with only 39 students forecasted. That's about 12 to 14 students per grade there. Also wanted to talk just a little bit about Harrison Park. wanted to lay out some of the statistics behind that for you, just to give you a little bit more insight into what was considered. So the choice here is really to have a more moderate utilization at the middle grade level in Southeast. And you can see here that without Harrison Park, utilization of the middle schools would be in that higher 90% range. Of course, we see the trend downward in the enrollment forecast reflected as well to a little bit lower 90% range. So that's really what it comes down to from a utilization standpoint. And I did also want to point out that some folks may have noticed that there's available middle school capacity to the north with Roseway Heights. But we just want to point out that, thinking ahead, especially to addressing the north-northeast goals that we heard Scott talk about a little bit earlier, it's going to be a really important asset for relieving overcrowding in the Grant cluster and to help with that K-8 to K-5 reconfiguration. So that, again, was part of the thinking there with respect to identifying Harrison Park. And you've also heard that it was originally built as a middle school. And if you think about its location, it's pretty well between Kellogg, Roseway Heights, and Mount Tabor as well. So I just want to give a little bit of that background. So back to data here. I'm just going to flash 3 slides for you really quickly. These are available in Dropbox, so you can look at these as your in your breakout groups today, and your facilitators also have this information. So this is just a breakout of the free meals rate per school, also broken out by neighborhood program versus dual language immersion. We have, again, focusing in on those middle grades. This is a breakdown of race and ethnicity. This first slide here is for the neighborhood programs. And the second slide here is for the dual language immersion programs. So those are available for you, as well as a summary statistics sheet that's really similar to what you've seen in the past. So this, what you're seeing here is maybe a little bit new. But we wanted to share with you kind of a visual way of exploring the feeder paths as you get into your work tonight. So every scenario that we've looked at that fall, that are related to scenarios 1 through 4 to date have used the feeder pattern that you're seeing here with Kellogg taking on Arleta, Creston, Lent, Marysville, and Harrison Park taking on Bridger and Vestal. And note also that we're showing the Selwood feeders here. Just wanted to be sure to do that because in phase 2, Lewis K5 will be brought on for potential changes. Also wanted to note that we're not showing creative science here, and that's because it's not being used as a neighborhood school currently. I know that we have considered that in a couple of the scenarios, but I just wanted to explain why that's not shown here in this example. And finally, for clarity, since this represents various scenarios, as you all know, we've had dual language immersion programs at many of these different schools. So just to make sure I didn't clutter this up too much, I didn't denote those. Now on the next slide here is scenario 5, which was the only scenario that we've looked at so far that is different from what I just had showed you. And that is based on taking Woodstock from the Hosford feeder pattern and moving it to Lane and then eventually to Franklin. And you see here also that I have identified the DLI locations. So as we move forward here with exploring different feeder patterns, I think this is a visual tool that we'll be coming back to again. So I'm going to set a little bit of this up, and then I'm going to hand it over to you, Kent, maybe just to add a little bit and get folks into the breakout rooms. But again, we're going to focus really on the feeder patterns tonight. We've got a new middle school opening. Kellogg needs to have its feeding K-5s identified. You've got some different ways of documenting the pattern changes that you're wanting to see in your breakout groups. So we've got a version of that kind of schematic that can be marked up. You can use annotation in your breakout groups, or you can comment on it as a PDF, those sorts of things. And then I also have created a worksheet that just has those pre-populated drop downs, so you can just select which schools are going to be nested underneath each of those middle schools. So I think at this point with bullet number 3, I'm going to kick it to you, Kent, just to kind of set expectations for what we'll be up to when we get back to the main room.
Yeah, thanks, Jed. So we've just kind of seen a few questions from the chat flash across as Jed was presenting. And yeah, this is the chance for the work groups to reflect upon what has been offered up as a scenario for feeder programs for Kellogg and for Harrison Park, and to make some changes with that. Maybe you see something that's not in one of those scenarios that you would like to see. And that would be something that we could, if you bring that forward with your group and your group wants to bring that forward to be modeled, then that would be something you would share in your notes so that we could then model that for next week. So that is the task at hand. We aren't necessarily looking at DLI programs in this process unless they are impacted by the reduction of a K to a K5, and then we would have to know where that DLI program would go at the 6-8 level. Generally, it would go to Kellogg because that's what we're looking at. But if you have another idea, certainly add that. So we're really focusing this down as was described earlier to make sure that we can work on this feeder pattern and really get into our time next week to look at the scenarios and then develop a proposal that we want to move forward for community input at the very next meeting. So yeah, I think we're ready, Jed, to get into breakout sessions. Each of the facilitators, please make sure that you have a member or members in your group that wants to share out what your thoughts are, either something that you like from what scenarios we have already or some changes to those scenarios, or even some potentially new scenarios that you'd like to add. We will ask for a short report out from each group. It'd be great to hear from some parents in the work groups. It doesn't just have to be the facilitator or the note taker. So discuss that as to see who you want to present, and we'll take a few minutes at the end of our breakout session to have each group present so that all the other groups can hear what the other good ideas are. One thing that we see happen a lot in these processes is that one group will come forward with something that other groups maybe didn't think about, or maybe only one other group thought about. And once it's presented and once it's modeled for the next week, then folks go, oh yeah, that one looks really good. Wish that was one we would have thought of, but it doesn't matter who thinks of it. If we come to consensus on what we want to move forward with at the end of next meeting, that's really what's important, is to get the best solution out there and best proposal out there for our community. So with that, I think we're ready, Jed, to move into our breakouts.
Yeah, so we're actually doing quite well on the agenda so far. We were scheduled to get in to our breakout groups at 7:10, and we are at 6:43. So we're going to give folks, let's say till 7:50, so we get a little bit more time for the report out back in the main room. So that'll give us a little over an hour. So I'm going to go ahead and set us to 65 minutes and open up the rooms.
Ready? That hour sure went fast, Jed. hopefully your group had some good conversations. I know our group did. Had a little bit of trouble, I think, kind of separating the work that we've done with all of our work with DLIs and scenarios and that, and trying to separate that from just looking more at the feeder pattern tonight. And so looking forward to hearing from groups. I'm just going to call on each of our facilitators, and you can let me know who in your group wants to respond out to what your discussion was. If you have a scenario that you want to kind of briefly describe, you certainly can do that. And then we'll work to make some models over the week so that we can bring those back for a discussion and look at by the whole group next week. So I'm going to jump we'll kind of keep it in order like we've done before. So Team Duke, Carl, if you want to share out or let us know who's going to share out from your group.
Lisa or Michael? Is it Michael? Are you sharing?
How about we do it this way, Lisa? If you're comfortable, I can start, and then Lisa, maybe you fill in because and the rest of the group too. So I guess what I would say is that we were all over the place. I mean, the conversation was intense and a lot of different thoughts that were brought up. I think we struggled, to be honest, a little bit trying to find the scenarios and really sort of dig into them. We were looking at the visuals that were provided in terms of today's PowerPoint. And I think sometimes we had to spend a little time just to really figure out where the feeder patterns were really happening and where things were going. So I think we took a fair amount of time in that. I guess there were some sort of some main concerns and questions, and then there's some feedback on some of the feeder patterns that I'll share. So I think one of the concerns was about split feeder patterns, and concern that maybe we should, in other words, an elementary that goes to two different middle schools, and really shouldn't we try to limit those? I think there was still questions, and obviously this may be part of phase 2, but there were still questions about are our DLI programs in the neighborhoods that they're serving the population, our emergent bilingual populations, and really doing that, a little more careful analysis around that. And if we are going to be about equity, couldn't we consider moving the Japanese program, for example, because it doesn't have a tie to a particular neighborhood, and could that help with the Mount Tabor enrollment? And then another question, which again would apply sort of as we go into phase 2 probably, but even thinking about, given the number of Vietnamese speaking students we have in the Southeast area, isn't that something we should also consider is part of that? So those are some of the questions and concerns that were coming up. I think there was, and not because Sabrina is in our group, but probably because Sabrina was in our group, we had a fair amount of focus also, Lisa and Sabrina, about a Vestal and concerns about it still remaining under-enrolled, and that should we expand their neighborhood to a greater degree? And the specific idea that we looked at or considered was about could it go into the Glencoe, Mount Tabor neighborhood more to help alleviate some of the Mount Tabor enrollment, but also to really help bolster Vestal's enrollment, their neighborhood catchment. I think one of the questions, and I don't know how to, maybe someone else on my group could, our group could help articulate this better, but what I captured in the notes was hoping that Flo could maybe really rethink neighborhood boundaries a little more to bring them, like adjusting just boundaries around neighborhoods and centering boundaries around the actual schools instead of sticking with some of the sort of traditional or what's been there to date. And I guess the other piece was really in phase 2 or phase 3 or whatever, is to really examine carefully focus options taking too much of any particular neighborhood. The acute example clearly right now is creative science taking 45% of Vestal's neighborhood population, and therefore Vestal being under-enrolled. So I know that we struggled a little bit to get specific about the 6-8 feeder patterns. I think those were the issues that were raised, at least according to my notes. So Lisa, do you want to add anything that I missed there, or some other ideas that I didn't capture?
No, I think that was about it. We talked a bit about Harrison Park, about is there any way at all that can open in 21?
Oh, right, yes.
Getting out to 22. Like, is there any miracle that can happen? That would be, because just thinking like that would alleviate a lot of pressure to do both Kellogg and Harrison Park at the same time. But I understand there needs to be structural changes to make it into a middle school.
All right, thank you. Team Flavel, Keeley.
Sure. Andy and Dee are going to share for our group.
Or you want to start? I'm okay.
No, you go ahead.
Okay. Let's see. Themes of our discussion. First of all, I think we all agreed that that focusing, at least today, on the middle school feeder pattern specifically was very helpful to have that narrower focus, and kind of felt like it made for a more productive conversation. So, for what that's worth, that was something we started with. We spent some time considering. We took a look at sort of I think we mostly were starting from the springboard and just looking at the feeder patterns there and the utilization numbers, and noticed that Harrison Park, I think in most of these scenarios, is maybe a little under-enrolled. I think it's in the mid-high 60s, whereas Kellogg, I think, is in the high 80s. And it was interesting, the principals in our group shared that really anything over 80%, once you start getting over 80%, a school actually starts to feel very full. So if Kellogg's sitting in the upper 80s, even right now, and that's before you account for potential increased popularity in its feeder schools once Kellogg opens, that we might be running the risk in a lot of these current scenarios of Kellogg being a little overcrowded. So in terms of specific scenarios we tried to play out, we were thinking, well, what can we do to try to take a little bit of enrollment from Kellogg to send somewhere else? And so then we started talking, the one specific scenario we started talking about was, what if we could go to, I think this was scenario 5 or some version of scenario 5, where maybe Woodstock feeds to Lane, which could then allow Creston to feed to Hosford. Creston's currently feeding Kellogg. So you take Creston out of Kellogg, feed it to Hosford, then that could be one approach to potentially reducing enrollment a little bit at Kellogg. But then we got to talking about potential unintended consequences of that. There's Michael, the principal of Lane, was talking about how simply moving one group of students in with another group of students, and sort of, or sometimes we talk about the assumption that bringing potentially a higher socioeconomic status group of students into a lower socioeconomic status group of students is automatically going to be beneficial, when in fact there has to be some real intentionality about building community there, and there's a lot of dimensions to that, and at minimum we'd want to think through that. There could also be consequences for a school's Title I status that can have a real effect, and that's something we want to look at if we went. So I think we came up with a couple of specific data questions and also larger kind of cultural questions and stuff to think through if we were going to go that route. And then there's also, I think, the fact that for that move to work, for Woodstock to go to Lane, you might have to move Whitman somewhere else, which would be a real concern, I think, for that community. So I don't think that we necessarily think that scenario we just proposed is the right one, but for what it's worth, we thought that potentially trying to reduce the projected enrollment at Kellogg might be something we want to look at, given the context that over 80% is going to feel really full. And I guess only one other thing I'd mention was we noted that the assumption here is that creative science is still a K-8, Some of us in our group remain very interested in potentially scenarios where creative science may factor into where Harrison Park K-5 students go. And I mean, that's a question for another day, but I'll just make that that's something that we mentioned. Dee, what did I miss?
And both John Horn from Arletta is also was in our group, and both him and Michael, it was a good reminder for us that I just want to make sure that we're not forgetting in this whole sort of process that even schools that have low SES and also are under enrolled still have really strong communities. And so I feel like sometimes in the discussions we've been focusing on moving those schools around as if they didn't have an attachment to their community or to where they are. And we just felt like it was really good to hear both of their experiences from multiple schools and at their own schools about what the effects are of that and what the communities are like there. And we just appreciated that perspective. So.
All right. Great, thank you. Well, I was able to have the opportunity to guest facilitator tonight, and so some really good discussions. We actually kind of started hitting our stride on a scenario and adding some things to it when we got to the final 2-minute warning. So I'm going to get to finish our thoughts, but we're going to have Jennifer will speak to start, and then Richard, and maybe Carissa, and maybe Tanya. We may have a lot of folks who might add in. So Jennifer, can you start us?
Thanks, Ken. I'll get us started from my notes. So we tried to really focus on the charge of K-8 6-8 and middle school and seeing around, populating Kellogg. So we talked about taking the current feeder pattern. I wish I could share my screen and have this on there, but of the pictures, with the schools or whatnot. And so we talked about keeping the same 4 elementaries feeding into Kellogg, Arleta, Creston, Lent, and Marysville, but adding the 6-8 Spanish DLI from Mount Tabor and Bridger to Kellogg as in the original scenario, so that all of Southeast Spanish DLI is together at one middle school at Kellogg. And then we talked about moving potentially Vestal over to the Mount Tabor feeder system with Glencoe to kind of respond to the lower enrollment that Mount Tabor would have, because if we moved 6-8 Spanish DLI from Bridger to Kellogg, that and moved Vestal over to Mount Tabor, that would leave Harrison Park really under-enrolled with space. And so we talked about the possibility of the 6-8 Japanese program being at Harrison Park with Neighborhood Bridger and whoever else, we're not sure. I think that's it.
Yeah, just to add, it would be Neighborhood Bridger and Neighborhood Harrison Park that would stay at Harrison Park, because they also have their own attendance boundaries right
now. All right, thank you. Team Hawthorne, Shanice.
I think Beth is going to start us off, and hopefully a couple other coalition members can hop in with my support.
All right. So we also appreciated the focus on feeder patterns. I thought that was really helpful. One thing that we talked about was like reflecting what some other people have mentioned, looking at feeding Vestal into Mount Tabor. And the pattern that we discussed was if Vestal, Glencoe, and possibly Richmond at Mount Tabor all fed to Madison, in looking at the way you might redraw boundaries to focus to make that make more sense. And then at Harrison Park, you would have, oh gosh, now I'm trying to remember what did okay, sorry. So Mount Tabor, I'm looking at the second one that we talked about now. Let me pull this up actually. Okay, so we would have at Mount Tabor, Glencoe, Vestal, and Richmond feeding to Madison. And then Harrison Park would feed to Franklin, and that would have Atkinson, Bridger, and Clark, CSS, however that school community ended up being defined, as a K-5 feeding to Harrison Park also. And then Creston, Arleta, Marysville, and Lent feeding to Kellogg and Franklin. So the main idea there was that swap of feeder patterns and looking at shifting high school as well as middle school feeder patterns. And then a variation on that was brought up to look at, we talked a lot about Woodstock and whether shifting Woodstock's feeder pattern to Lane was an appropriate decision or not, and what other options around Lane's enrollment we might consider. So something else we talked about was Arleta to Lane, in which case that could then propose a shift of Atkinson to Kellogg, and that one we were running out of time in the last 2 minutes, but those were just sort of thinking outside the box on the feeder patterns, I think would be the theme of our group's meeting. Anyone else want to add to that?
Atkinson to Harrison Park was part of that one?
Yeah. One was Atkinson to Harrison Park, one was Atkinson to Kellogg.
Okay, thank you. Team Holgate, so Esther, your group.
I'm speaking for Holgate tonight, and it sounds like there were a lot of similar conversations happening this evening, because we also, when we really neighbored in on middle school feeder patterns, we had current Harrison Park with the idea thrown in there that Clark becomes a neighborhood K through 5, Atkinson and Bridger feeding to Harrison Park, and then that feeds to Franklin, where Vestal and Glencoe feed to Mount Tabor, and it feeds to Madison. And then we had Marysville, Arleta, Lent, and Creston, like in the proposals, feeding to Kellogg, which feeds to Franklin. We did speak a little bit about Woodstock feeding to Lane, but also Lewis as well. Although we did talk a little bit about how that would change the high school feeder patterns with Cleveland and Franklin, and it would be something worth looking into just based geographically. It made a whole lot more sense to our group. Is there anything else from my group that I'm missing?
Thank you.
We talked about potentially Sunnyside leaving the Franklin cluster and moving to Cleveland to make up for the over enrollment at Franklin.
Thanks, Marissa.
All right, let's jump to Team Powell. So Stephen.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, Team Powell, we had a great conversation tonight, and I think a lot of our conversation where we did a lot of work was with Andrew, and if Andrew wants to speak up, and then I think Sheila and Sean can support him as necessary, but our main ideas came from Andrew. Or conversation, if you will. You're muted, Andrew, right now. Sorry. There you go.
Okay, I'll do the best I can. We kind of talked right up to the bell. So one of the things that I had, shared with the group and then the group talked about was just some in the South Tabor neighborhood regarding the boundaries being revised and how we could support the process of getting Kellogg opened. And the thing that I heard a lot in our neighborhood and what we talked about as a group was kind of riffing off of the 1A and moving the moving the boundary for both Franklin and Kellogg and Atkinson to incorporate the neighborhood for which all three of those schools sit in, which is the South Tabor neighborhood. So the Franklin boundary would shift up to division. The Kellogg boundary would also shift up to division. The 67th boundary would go away and shift to 82nd. In talking about what impacts that had and what we could do with some of the space available in, or some of the pressure put on Atkinson, if there was any, some of the pressure put on Kellogg. We talked about looking at Mount Tabor and kind of had a similar conversation about the relationship of Mount Tabor to Vestal that I think other groups have talked about. And I actually put a neighborhood boundary up there, and there is a neighborhood boundary that would kind of show where lines could be drawn to bring Mount Tabor to into that group. So we were concerned about Glencoe's enrollment and how that would be impacted, and there was a lot of conversation, and I don't feel like I can talk about some of the other things that we talked about. It was very interesting. So maybe someone else could take that.
I'll just mention one other thing that Sean actually brought forward was the idea of looking at combining, sort of shifting the way our grades are. So we might have one school building that had a K through 2 or a K through 3 sort of arrangement, but would have both like a focus program and a neighborhood program. And then, all those students would then proceed to a different building that had, again, kind of co-located programs, but of grades 3 or 4 through 5 or 6. So we were just trying to think of ways of utilizing our existing buildings in a creative approach.
Anybody else? That group? All right. Well, it's great to hear from the groups. It's always interesting for us at Flow to hear kind of the group dynamics, and when we get to this point where we're looking at scenarios, and we've done it for several meetings now, and it's always interesting to see how ideas start to coalesce. I saw it in the chat that different group members were saying, hey, that's what our group talked about, or that's real similar to what we talked about. And it really just takes a while to look at all the different scenarios before kind of the ideas start to converge around certain options that seem to make sense and seem to hit the outcomes better than others. And so as we move forward into next week, Jed will be working, as he does each week, feverishly to determine to model those scenarios and the options that folks and groups have brought forward tonight. And so we'll bring those back to our next meeting, and we'll be working as a group to determine, okay, which one or ones make sense to bring forward the next evening at the open house for some community input. So that's what we'll be working on. We do want to do, as we promised earlier, take a step down using this fist to 5. And so we have 2 very basic questions that I think each of the facilitators ask their groups at the very start, just so that we can practice a little bit, this fist to 5. Doesn't mean that you're wedded to what your answer is, but we kind of just want to do a temperature check right now on a couple of questions. And so I'm going to turn it over to Jed to review that with us, and we'll practice that tonight.
Thank you, Kent. I did also just want to get a plug in for just letting folks know that, I heard a lot of talk about moving boundaries or just talking about sort of wholesale feeder patterns. I do want to just encourage folks that, if you need to be looking at boundary changes so you can, sort of split the difference between some of the issues that you're seeing as you're moving attendance areas wholesale. That's definitely something that we can model and can include in a scenario. And as we said a little bit earlier in the meeting about just capturing that information by end of day on Sunday, we can take it in multiple forms. I would really encourage folks to be able to, either communicate via email or just collaborate with their work group if they need more time, after the meeting tonight, just to maybe iron out some of those things and sketch out what maybe some of those split the difference type situations might look like on a map, using the web map or whatever it is that works for you. So heard a lot of good stuff tonight, though. I'm excited to see what came out in the worksheets and what kind of annotations folks came up with. So, fist to 5. This will be a fun little practice session here. as I mentioned earlier, we've looked at a lot of different scenarios, but from a strictly feeder pattern standpoint, they really kind of boil down to just a couple different situations here. And so I'm going to launch a poll here that lets you choose one answer for each of these two scenarios or set of scenarios here for feeder patterns. And I did this time include an abstain option. So, but I feel like there are quite a good number of options here for you. So hopefully nobody feels the need to use that. But I'm going to go ahead and launch that, and then I'll turn it back over so you can see the results. Let's give that.
If I could just add one thing, Jed, just to be clear, we're not saying that these are the only two options that are there. These are the only two options really that have been developed and presented scenarios. So tonight we heard a lot of different options that we're going to work on and present. So really this is just a practice tonight. We're not taking this data to say, oh, look at what the group decided on the 22nd of October from this Vista 5 activity. This truly is an example of using it. And we just want to use it with a couple of questions from scenarios that we've developed just to kind of get a gauge of where our folks are. But we certainly know there's going to be a lot more scenarios that we're going to bring forward next week based on the work tonight.
Thanks, Kent. Yeah, and I think it was important for us not to spring this consensus model on you on a decision-making night. So without any further ado, let me go ahead and launch that poll. And of course, our district staff and facilitators, you can either click the abstain button or don't fill it out at all. We've got about half of the attendees have voted at this point. Again, not expecting everybody since we've got district and flow staff. Okay, there are just a couple more trickling in, it looks like. Okay, we've been hanging out at about 38 for about a minute now, so I'm going to end polling. And I'm going to share those results. So Kent, can you see those there and kind of walk us through what you're seeing?
Yeah, so again, it just gives us kind of a snapshot of what people are thinking. And so we'd like to use this type of consensus model and protocol moving forward. So next week we'll spend some time getting some community feedback from the feedback that we've been requesting either through phone surveys and through regular surveys. And then we'll also take a look at the scenarios that you've provided information on tonight. And then we'll probably be doing this type of a poll a couple of times to try to winnow down some scenarios to get to some one, preferably, but it could be more than one that we get to at the end of the evening next week to then share with the community. And so we'll talk more about that process and what that proposal looks like. But yeah, it's good. It looks like we have certainly some input that we could go on. Looks like probably on these questions, maybe a little bit higher, number one versus number two, but definitely something that would promote some more conversation, which is really what we want.
Yeah, I think I was going to ask, how would you interpret these in a consensus model? Like when it does come time for decision time, you know, these are pretty well distributed.
Yeah.
Except for all the abstains. We'll have to take that away at decision time, maybe.
Yeah, I think what we'd have to do is have more conversation, Josh. You know, we do ask that in some of these numbers that people give is either a major change that they could live with or a minor change and they could live with. So we would ask folks, what are some of those changes that you think you would propose in order to move from, say, a 2 to a 3 or from a 1 to a 2? And so we would really be a conversation starter to discuss that. And then we'd probably re-poll and saying, okay, if we were to add that, let's re-poll that and see what the numbers look like. So it certainly isn't a standalone, and there has to be conversation and discussion around that moving forward. One thing it can do, I think, is it can tell us this scenario, you know, is one that we probably don't want to move forward with. But there'll probably be several that folks may want to move forward with. So we may find that we have more than one that we bring forward for input at the first open house, which is okay. Other thoughts on that?
And if I can just say, the chat has been pretty clear that a lot of people are saying they would actually prefer to have multiple options to bring to the open house. So just bringing that to the forefront.
Yep. Thank you. All right, well, I'm going to turn over to Esther for some final words tonight.
All right. Thank you all very much for your participation tonight. The conversations were definitely rich and very, very focused. I believe we actually made a couple of strides towards the established goal for phase 1. Thank you. In closing, and on behalf of the district leadership, I do want to thank you for your willingness to continue to engage and collaborate. We're very excited at the prospect of having a feeder pattern for Kellogg Middle School, which is scheduled to open in the fall of 2021, and an outcome for reconvening Harrison Park from a K-8 school to a 6-8 school. Please let us continue to review and refine our scenarios as needed. Send in your improved, modified, refined scenarios by Sunday evening so that we can look at them and we can, based on the information that we have, create the scenarios in preparation for our next meeting. Also, kindly remember to complete the meeting evaluation. I am certain we can come to a very, very close outcome, even if we cannot reach the perfection that we're striving for. Again, thank you for your participation and your willingness to collaborate and for your engagement. Thank you also for centering our students. Stay safe, travel home safely, and we'll see you on the 29th of October. Have a great evening, and the meeting is adjourned.